Home is more than walls and roofs. It is the streets where you first rode a bicycle, the shops where your parents bought food, the neighbors who became a family. Home is more than a place. It is memory. It is family. It is identity. And for thousands of South Africans, the government decided their home did not belong to them. Hello and welcome back to On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rehana. Today, we unpack the Group Areas Act of 1950. This act sought to destroy the homes for millions of South Africans. It divided cities, erased communities, and forced people into exile within their own country. This act was apartheid's cornerstone. I feel like I've said that or something similar or spoken about the insidious or cruel or all these same words apply to not only the three we've unpacked, but the ones before that. But what these laws did, they worked together in concert to enforce apartness, aka apartheid. It gave the government power to declare any district for one race only. Today we visit District 6, Sophiatown, and Southend, and hear the voices of those who lived through this heartbreak, whose stories of loss and resilience remain the true chronicles of apartheid. And I'll tell you my family's story too. My hair is hearing today. The Group Areas Act was apartheid's instrument of spatial segregation. The main goal was to physically separate racial groups by designating specific geographic areas, for exclusive occupation by a particular race, which is the white, colored Indian or African Bantu. What was the other one? I'm missing one. Black. It designated racial groups to specific urban areas and banned them from others. It was simple in legislation and devastating in consequence. It said, you do not belong here. You must leave, even though you've lived there your whole life. The law uprooted lives. Businesses were destroyed. Homes were bulldozed. I can't emphasize that enough. I think people talk about the removals of these people from these areas, but not enough emphasis is put on the destruction of the area that those peoples were in. Their homes were razed to the ground, not just their removal. Their existence was eviscerated physically and mentally. Then these communities were scattered to the urban peripheries, so the outside, always on the outside. So how did it work? The Act authorized the Governor General, who then later became the state president, to declare certain areas, certain urban and rural areas as group areas. Once declared, the land could only be owned or occupied by people of that specific racial group, which they would have been classified into from the Population Registration Act. Non-compliance led to forced evictions, demolitions, and resettlements to racially assigned zones. Local authorities and here it comes. The Group Areas Board implemented and enforced these removals, backed by the police and military if necessary. Sorry. As one survivor from District 6 said, I was 12 when they came. Our house was small, but full of love. They told us to leave within days. My mother cried as we packed our memories into a cart. Then another survivor says, they told us to leave our homes, our shops, our schools. I remember the trucks, the police, the children crying. We didn't know where we would go. Across South Africa, families experience this trauma over and over again. For many, survival meant adaptation and resistance. Over the next decades, the Act tore through cities across the country, leaving scars that remain visible and invisible to this day. So we visit District 6 first. District 6 in Cape Town was once a vibrant hub of colored, Indian, and African communities. And you'll understand that a lot of these communities were racially integrated societies. All lived together, all lived next to each other. And there's always a vibe when people speak about it. Its streets were alive with jazz, commerce, and smell of home-cooked food. In 1966, the government declared District 6 a white-only area and renamed it Sonneblom. Over 60,000 people were forcibly removed. Families were sent to the barren edges of the Cape Flats, often far from jobs, schools, and hospitals. Houses that had stood for generations were bulldozed and land sold to white developers. One survivor says, "I was 7 when they came. I remember holding my mother's hand as the truck took us away. I looked back and saw my home being torn down. It felt like the city itself was crying." Next survivor. "I remember the smell of fresh bread from my neighbor's shop, the music spilling into the streets, and then one day, the silence. Our homes were gone before we knew what had happened." Another survivor. "We were scattered across the Cape Flats. Some families never saw each other again. Our roots were torn out, but the stories remained. We whispered them to each other to survive." District 6 became both a memory and a warning. The apartheid state could destroy property, but not the spirit of its people. District 6 became a symbol of loss and resilience and the enduring power of memory. Next, we visit Sophiatown. Sophiatown was Johannesburg's answer to vibrancy, a cultural, multiracial hub. Its residents included Black, colored, and Indian families. It was a place of music, literature, and activism. In 1955, the government declared it a white area, called it something like Triumph, which means triumph in Latin. Over the next 2 years, more than 60,000 residents were removed. Homes were demolished, churches dismantled, and a cultural heart ripped. So one survivor says, Sophiatown was music and life. When they bulldozed it, they weren't just destroying buildings, they were trying to destroy our souls. Another survivor. "I used to walk down the street and hear jazz in every home. The smell of cooking, the laughter, the poetry on street corners. It was alive." And then the bulldozers came. Another survivor states, "They says it was to improve the city, but it wasn't about improvement. It was about control. They packed us into meadowlands miles away. Our community was broken, our memories scattered, but our songs remained. Churches, schools, and social clubs were dismantled, yet Sophiatown spirit lived on through jazz, protest songs, and storytelling." Then we go to where my parents grew up, in Southend, Port Elizabeth. It was Port Elizabeth back then. They faced a similar fate, a working class community with families who had lived there for generations. It was also Indian, coloreds, whites, completely racially integrated. In the 1960s, the government declared it a white area. They did not rename it, but all the residents were forcibly removed. Fishfolk, shop owners, and teachers sent to distant, underdeveloped townships like New Brighton. One survivor says, "The fishing boats belonged to our fathers and grandfathers. When they forced us out, we lost the water, the market, the friends. But they couldn't take the story of our lives. We carried them wherever we went. We were sent to townships like New Brighton. The houses were small, the land barren, the streets unfamiliar. We had to rebuild our lives from memory, and that memory became our resistance." And another survivor says, "We didn't just lose our houses. We lost the markets where we bought our food, the neighbors who were like families. It was if someone had torn the roots out of a tree and expected it to grow again." Southend story may be lesser known to most of South Africans, but its pain and resilience is no less profound. When my parents talk about Southend, the joy, the internal joy that you see beaming through their eyes. They talk about people helping people. My mom, who grew up Muslim, used to help at the church carrying food to old people. My dad used to do work for people and go buy. He still has such a sweet tooth. Get his money and go buy something at the bakery. The connections, what they did when it rained, where they played, it's always with such joy and great memory. And when I was doing this, I realized we never really spoke about their removal. And when we sat down, there's just moments, even for them, that recounting it, they realized certain things. They were 11 and 10 when they found out they would be moving. Now, note, my mom had lost her dad the year before. So this was a really tough time for people who owned a home would go lost. My dad and his family rented, so they were moved first. The house they moved into was a shell. What do I mean? It had 4 walls. It had a roof. There was no ceiling. There was no electricity. There were no indoor toilets or bathrooms. There was no running water. And so you got the shell, and there you go. So they moved into an area that was not set up for human settlement. There were no indoor streetlights. The roads weren't gravel. They were concrete slabs. So these paths had never been there. That's the image I have in my brain. Obviously, I wasn't there. Then my mom, because I was like, okay, so how did you know? How did you know when you were going to move? No, we all got a letter saying we were going to move, and then you had to pack your stuff up and you waited for the truck to fetch you. And my mom speaks about, because there were some of the last people to leave, she said, and people do speak about, the demolition of houses and all of those as heartbreaking. And she said, as a 9 or 10-year-old girl, she couldn't bring herself to go and look where people had been removed. And she's so happy today that she does not have that image in her head. She does recount that, as I spoke about, there was no indoor, outdoor streetlights. None of that exists. No electricity. She speaks about the first night they moved into the Shalaba house. She was so afraid because it was so dark. It took her a while to get used to the blackness. Snow light. Where they had lived in Southend, the kids would gather on the streets. They would play until 8 p.m. under the streetlights. There were no adults. They were just safe it was just safe for them to be outside. Now they moved to this area where there was nothing, absolutely nothing. And knowing that my grandparents had owned the house, knowing you getting stuck into the shell of a house, I wanted to know what their house looked like that they had left behind. And this description just broke my heart. So they had a 4-bedroom home with indoor bathrooms, a sitting room for guests, a laundry, a kitchen with a massive table, and an indoor wood stove. Doesn't that just make you feel, wow, that must have been awesome. It was palatial, right? And then they were moved into the Shah. Knowing there was no electricity, I said, okay, so when did you eventually get electricity? They couldn't remember. They were looking at each other, trying to figure out the timeline. They said, okay, the street lights came first, okay? But they don't remember the time frame where the indoor electricity came. My mom then clocked that when she got married to my dad and my sister was born, there was still no electricity. And this was 11 years after they had been moved. Now think, this doesn't only impact the lack of light, but they couldn't have a refrigerator. My mom called her mom, well, we all called her Omimi, and she recounts coming to visit her mom in her house because she had gotten remarried. My mom was either living with her sister or eventually got married to my dad. She said she used to put jelly on the floor to get it to set. Her meat was also on the floor to keep for Sunday cooking. Because she got a meat on a Friday and then she would cook for Sunday. So she had to keep it fresh. It was in that moment that my mom was like, how did she do it? And the two of them are looking at each other. Just that, like, how did she do that? You know, she said this is probably why they had so much veggie dishes. It would have been expensive to buy meat all the time. Then I was recently having a conversation with somebody on a hike, and I was talking about the certain dish my father's mom made, which it was my ma, right? And she'd make this stew with beef and butter beans, and it was very vinegary. I then realized, like, a lot of the stuff, like during that time or when I was growing up, or those type of people, was kind of vinegary based, or, you know, there was that flavor in some of it. And then you realize maybe it was to get like bad things out because they couldn't refrigerate. I don't know. I'm making an assumption as I was reflecting. We're still speaking, and I'm like, okay, guys, when did you get electricity? Did we have electricity when I was born, which would have been 3 years post my sister? Yes. This whole time they had been living with paraffin lamps. So great for your eyes and so safe. In 70s, paraffin lamps would have been the pinnacle, right, of safety. Then, so we counted it out and we got to, well, it would have been 14 years after they moved into the area, which meant Mimi, who had had this palatial home that she married my grandfather, lost him here before they were moved out of this beautiful home and into the shell. And she never had the comfort that she was removed from the same way. It's in those moments of recounting and retelling a story that you realize how people just got on with it. Some people speak about the deep scar, and some people just go, that is then we need to move forward. My grandmother, Mimi, was, from what I've understood, an extraordinary woman. I imagine she didn't think too much about what she had lost, but more about what to take care of today and make sure that everyone is taken care of. My dad, forever the optimist, he was like, we just got used to walking in the dark, man. His daddy. He's like, you used to have this trick because you would be walking and the only light would be the street light. And you couldn't really see people coming towards you if you're walking out at night. So the way people used to do it, they used to bend to be able to see people coming in the distance so that it wouldn't blind you and you could say, sounds so safe. But he was just like, we just got on with it. And I believe him. I think of the area I grew up in. I do not think about the fact that I had lost something because it wasn't mine to lose at that stage, right? I don't know if that makes sense. But what I consciously grew up in was a community. We could play outside. We had each other's backs. My cousins were around the corner. We had friends around the corner. Our neighbors we spoke to wasn't just on the sides or in front of us, it was behind us too. This community, the mosque, the church, the whatever it was so well put together, looked after, structured. It didn't occur to me as a child growing up that I was losing something by being in this community. And if I look at everything consciously that was around me, it was beautiful. We had a little house, we had a nice big yard, we had a car, we had a beautiful front lawn, we had a beautiful big tree out that we used to play out at. We had a beautiful big rose bush under our main window. We had a record player that would be playing Bob Marley, Queen, all these old African American four men, like the Tops. Anyway, and that is my joyous memory. The only time I hated where we lived was when we had to go to the beach. I was so far away from the beach. Really, really far away. It was definitely pack, a blikkie kos, we used to pack up our fruit and our lunch and all our drinks. My father still loves the beach. We love the beach. We would go every Sunday, but to get there was a mission. We used to have to ride past every whites-only beach to get to our beach. And I think at some stage I asked, why do we drive past here? And my dad was like, well, our beach is better. Listen, it was an adventure, that's for sure. It was very rocky. We used to go and jump off the rocks. And yeah, that's where I learned to swim. That's where we had swimming buddies that we all saw each other there on Sundays. It was great. And when we were allowed to go to the previously white beaches, the first one we were like, why? Okay, they might keep this one. We eventually did find a beach along the strip of beaches that we weren't allowed into that we really enjoyed. But initially we were like, no, we're going to go to our beach. Our beach is nice, I remember once they tried to put up and make it a whites only beach, and the swimming community that came together there on a Sunday just tore it down. But let's get back to our story. The Group Areas Act was more than a law. It was psychological warfare. Did I not say this last week? I did. Communities were fractured, identity suppressed, and cultures displaced. Many survivors faced unemployment, disconnection, and social marginalization. Children grew up far from grandparents and schools. Businesses collapsed, and yet people endured. Between 1950 and mid-1980s, an estimated 3.5 to 4 million people were forcibly removed from their homes under the Grouped Areas Act. This made it one of the largest mass displacements of people in the 20th century, rivaling wartime displacements in scale. As a survivor said, we learned to survive, but we never forgot. Every family gathering reminded us of what we had lost. Every street corner was a story we could never return to. Another survivor said, they took our homes, but they didn't take our stories. We carry them in our hearts and pass them to our children. This is our resistance. Yet, survivors did not just endure. They resisted. Through storytelling, reunions, and advocacy, they preserved the memory of what apartheid tried to erase. We have to think about always the psychological and emotional impact. Obviously, your identity and your belonging. When you are forcibly removed from your home, which breaks ancestral, spiritual, and emotional ties to land, people felt erased as if their history and existence had been declared invalid. Former residents often describe a sense of rootlessness or invisible grief. One survivor said, we didn't just lose our homes, we lost the rhythm of our lives. The smell of bread from the bakery, the call to prayer, the sound of kids playing on the stoop. That was all taken from us. Extended families were separated as the government classified them differently or assigned them to different areas. Interracial marriages and friendships were criminalized or physically impossible due to zoning restrictions. Many survivors internalized feelings of inferiority, humiliation, and powerlessness. The trauma manifested itself in depression, substance abuse, and the breakdown of community cohesiveness. The emotional scars of displacement was passed down. We spoke about it last week. Intergenerational trauma. Younger generations inherited fractured family histories, fractured community identity, and inherited poverty. The Cape Flats, for example, became an epicenter of social problems, gang violence, unemployment, and overcrowding directly linked to forced removal. Psychologists today describe this as a form of spatial trauma, where geography itself becomes a reminder of loss and displacement. Today, District 6 is a museum, which I visited recently, a reminder of what was lost and a place of hope. Sophiatown has a heritage trail, and its music lives on in South African jazz. Southend also has a museum, and its descendants continue to tell their stories, building community even after decades of displacement. The one thing about Southend was that the two mosques survived. The Group Areas Act was repealed in 1991, but its consequences endured in urban planning, social inequality, and the collective memory. A Sophiatown survivor says, "We rebuilt in our hearts first. We sang the songs, told the stories, and kept the spirit alive. This is how we resisted, through memory, through culture, through each other." Then a Southend survivor says, "Apartheid tried to erase us, but we refuse to be erased. Our children know where we come from, and that knowledge is our power." Oh yeah, they talk about it a lot. One survivor says, "We were scattered, but our roots are still here. We were silenced, but our voices are still strong. We were displaced, but our home is in our hearts." Memory becomes resistance. Identity becomes rebellion. And in every story, every photograph, every song, the truth of apartheid's cruelty endures, but so does the courage of those who survive. So we talk about intergenerational trauma, but what as a country, as we are today, what are the effects or side effects or long-term implications of what was done then? So today, the layout of South African cities still reflects the apartheid design. White suburbs still remain close to business districts and schools. Obviously, anyone can move there now, but let's call it previously white suburbs. Black and colored communities still live in townships or peripheral areas with poor transport, fewer services, and lower property values. When I say that, I mean collectively, mass, you're looking at still being the norm rather than the exception, right? So families who were forcibly removed obviously lost their property that could have been passed down, which meant that you had this wealth inequality, and that economic gap still exists where the average white-household income remains several times higher than that for Black or colored households. And we're talking mass, not pockets. Okay, just to be clear. The Group Areas Act teaches us that home is not just a physical space. It's a culture, it's a community and connection. It reminds us that oppression is not only physical, but psychological. And just like that, with one law and one act, we were relegated to the outskirts and places not ready for human existence. We went from being close to our jobs and the city center to being on the outside of the city limits, traveling to jobs that we needed to provide for our families with no infrastructure set up. We were cut off from built-up living as if we were not human. Always so scared. They were always so scared of non-whites taking over and claiming what was theirs to begin with, right? Your fear became our dehumanizing and degrading. Your greed became our generational trauma. And you wonder why resistance was your lived experience through anxiety of us in the prison you created for all of us. Because let's not be mistaken. When the die was cast and this law was put into action, you did it to yourself too. When you separated us from each other, you turned your own people into villains, enforcers, and dredged up evil untold in a people who would have to live with the consequences of their actions for a long time. You pulled the heart out of your nation, and we reached deep into ourselves and enriched ours. And that is how I feel about what happened there. To end, I have text I found when I was at the District 6 Museum that I'd love to read. Remember Dambaza, remember Botshabelo, Onverwacht, Southend, Eastgate, Sophiatown, Makuleke, Atto Manor. Remember District 6. Remember the racism which took away our homes and our livelihood, and which sought to steal away our humanity. Remember also our will to live, to hold fast to that which marks us as human beings, our generosity, our love of justice, and our care for each other. Remember Tramway Road, Modderdam, Simonstown. In remembering, we do not want to recreate District 6, but to work with its memory of hurts inflicted and received, of lost achievements, and of shame. We wish to remember so that we can all together and by ourselves rebuild a city which belongs to all of us, in which all of us can live, not as races, but as people. In a poem that was, and I'll put the picture up on a tile in the floor. Miss it if you don't look. It's from Sophiatown in 1962. The day they came for our house, the sun stood still in the sullen wintry sky, a witness to the impending destruction. Armed with bulldozers, they came to do a job, nothing more than just hired killers. We gave way. There was nothing we could do, although the bitterness stung in us. In the place we knew to be part of us, in the earth around, we stood, slow, painfully slow. Clumsy crushes crawled over the firm pillars, not the rooms that house us, not the rooms that held us, and the roof that covered us, and the roof that covered our heads, dust. We stood. Dust clouded our visions. We held back our tears. It was over in minutes, done. Bulldozers have power. They can take apart in a few minutes all that had been built up over the years and raised over generations and generations of children. The power of destroying, the pain of being destroyed. Don Matera. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed that. It was a nice moment to reflect on my own family's journey through this. If anybody wants to share their family story, feel free to drop it to me. I'm happy to listen to these stories, and I know how much our parents love. Next week, we start with activists, and then we'll do a series of apartheid heroes, which I'm excited about. One in particular that's been one that stuck in my mind from the moment I heard it, and someone that just wait. I hope it sticks with you like it did with me. Remember to subscribe if you're not subscribed yet. Thank you for listening, and we'll see each other next week. Bye.